It's time to grab a branch and spread the fire inside the Deku Tree. First thing to note is that since it's basically the tutorial dungeon, Navi stops you quite a bit to explain how things work, like opening doors and pushing blocks. For a first dungeon, it introduces a good amount of stuff, fittingly giving you a projectile and forcing the use of Deku sticks to burn webs, including rolling. Probably the most complex part of the process is using a high fall to break through a spider web, which might stump you if you don't know you can. It's mostly a linear dungeon, although the compass room is completely optional and there's even a bombable wall you'd have to come back later to access. For a first dungeon, it does a good job introducing you to a variety of mechanics, even swimming to press a button and getting under a roller of spikes. I'd say it's a very good start to show you what you can come to expect from Zelda's variety of dungeons. It even ends with a pretty decent boss with Goma. It's time to walk through some lunch in Jabu-Jabu's belly. The theme is definitely the strongest part about this one, since it's inside a great fish and thus has a very organic looking layout, including esophagus doors. The main gimmick for at least a chunk of it is carrying the great ball of sunshine that is Princess Ruto, who will helpfully act like a spoiled brat every step of the way. Well, one plus is you get the boomerang, so now you've got a long-ranged option that doesn't chew up ammo, in addition to just bringing items straight to you. My main criticism of the dungeon is there seems to be a lack of optional areas, especially compared to Dodongo's Cavern. It's very much straightforward mostly. Well, at least it has a very engaging boss, not to mention an arguably more proper mini-boss, so it has that going for it. It's time to blue blaze it in the Ice Cavern. Now, this is technically a mini-dungeon, so you can't expect it to be too long, lacking mini-bosses or bosses of any kind, except maybe a white wolf to get the dungeon item. However, my main criticism with the mini-dungeon is that its mechanism relies on bottles, which sure you might have all four, but you might have as little as just one of them. At least it has different opportunities to fill up if you happen to be unfortunate with your bottle count. It has a few interesting puzzles like collecting silver rupees in a spinning scythe room and a pushing block at least, so it doesn't feel too lacking. Ultimately, it does what it needs to do, get you the iron boots to set up for the water temple, even if the blue fire being stored in bottles can potentially be a hassle if you don't have many. It's time to fight thyself in the water temple. This is probably the most infamous dungeon in the game, though I will say the 3DS version makes it a lot more bearable by marking the water changers and hot swap iron boots. Even with that though, a lot of the areas can be trial and error with you having to set things up a certain way in certain water levels, not to mention the boss isn't that fun. What it does have going for it though is some exploratory value, since some of the keys are getting the order you want and it doesn't feel like a strictly straight line. It also has arguably the best mini-boss in the game with a Mirage Island, and then you see a shadow of yourself, even if the big Goron sword trivializes the fight. Ultimately, the 3DS version does a lot to alleviate the dungeon, but it's still at best a mixed bag and can be a little frustrating. It's time to work those guns in Gerudo Training Grounds. This is the one optional dungeon or mini-dungeon in the game, basically a trial if you want to get the Ice Arrow, mostly including it because the wiki lists it. Now, it does lack a map, compass, or anything really describable as a boss other than two white wolves, but it has some interesting challenges that require even the silver gauntlets if you want to 100% it. Probably the most challenging part about it is some of them, like getting silver rupees in one and killing enemies in a couple others, are on timers so you can't take too long. The underwater one also has an interesting wrinkle of currents if you try to cheese it without wearing iron boots. While it's more of a set of trials than a mini-dungeon, it works well for what it is, and ice arrows are a suitable reward for the amount of challenge involved. It's time for some volatile explosives in Dodongo's Cavern. Basically, it's the map that introduces Dodongos and those lovable smoke-producing bombs that they dislike so much, or so I'm told. One nice thing about this one is this dungeon has more optional paths behind bombable walls and other such things, netting gold Skulltula tokens, the map and compass, among other things. It also has arguably the first thing described as a mini-boss in the form of two different areas where you have to fight two Lizalfalls in order to progress, funnily enough in the same room but different heights. King Dodongo certainly lives up to their disliking of smoke, since you have to pop bombs into his mouth as he's charging up. I'd say this dungeon nicely progresses things over the first, and some of the puzzles like ice switches and blowing a pillar down are pretty satisfying. It's time to avoid the Reaper's Scythe in the Shadow Temple. This dungeon mostly emphasizes puzzles rather than exploration, though that isn't to say there aren't some optional rooms and secrets to poke around in. Dead Hand makes a reappearance as a mini-boss, but is quite frankly laughable in the face of the big Goron sword, and he was pretty easy before. Bongo Bongo, on the other hand, is a fairly interesting boss, especially by design, looking like a prisoner who was hung upside down with arms and head chopped off. The ship ride was unique, with the style flows of the ship sinking if you stay on it too long, not to mention the 3DS version greatly improves the figurehead on it. Overall, the Shadow Temple may feel straight-lined a lot of the time, but it certainly has a tense atmosphere and nicely continues the Wells theme of messing with you. It's time for some Megaton fun in the Fire Temple. This dungeon is definitely not afraid to play some deceptive tricks on you, from attacking floor tiles to flame walls to fake doors that try to slam down on you. As expected, this dungeon heavily emphasizes lava and explosives and things of that nature, but it also has the embodiment of pure raw power that is the Megaton Hammer. Eat your heart out, MC Hammer. One of the main gimmicks is freeing Gorons so they don't become a dragon's meal. It's basically a mechanism to get keys in the boss key, but it helps to give it more of a personal touch. While the dungeon doesn't feel as exploratory as the Forest Temple, it does give you options where to go. Add in a whack-a-mole boss, and I'd say the dungeon leaves a positive impression, and not just because Darunia is a real bro. Your eyes are lying to you because it's the bottom of the well. I think the more interesting part of this mini-dungeon is if you know what you're doing, you can get the item you need alarmingly fast. If, however, you want to stick around, it makes good use of the Lens of Truth with its various deceptive traps and rewards you with a few gold skulltulas. The boss, so to speak, is infamous in the series for its creepiness, even if the 3DS version goes a bit too far in my opinion with sanitizing it and the mini-dungeon. Despite this though, I respect it for its sheer amount of exploratory options and for the suitably disturbing theme that ties it to the Shadow Temple. Even though it's a mini-dungeon, it very much leaves a lasting impression, especially since you have to pull a time paradox just to get into it. It's time for 2 giant pains in the neck in the Spirit Temple. It's pretty fitting that it's the final regular dungeon because it's like 2 mini-dungeons in one, complete with 3 mini-bosses and 2 dungeon items. Though you have to leave and come back, it's pretty cool that the first half is for Child Link and then the second half is for Adult Link, sorta like the bottom of the well and Shadow Temple rolled into one. It's a pretty challenging mini-boss too, at least by Ocarina of Time standards. Those iron knuckles hit hard if you aren't careful, though the big Goron sword still cuts like hot butter. My only nitpick is phase 1 of the boss is slightly luck-based, lining them up, but it's trivial. Ultimately, this is a very well put together penultimate dungeon, even if it's not the most exploratory dungeon out there, with a nice aesthetic and good puzzles. It's time to stare at paintings too hard in the Forest Temple. This dungeon is slightly more open than previous ones, which I appreciate, and it largely has you collecting a few keys at the beginning after the fire is taken from the elevator. The dungeon introduces the bow and arrow, Goron Link's answer to the slingshot, and there's also an interesting gimmick where a couple halls can be twisted, changing subsequent rooms. There's also a theme of wandering spirits, from the ghost that stole the elevator's flame you have to fight to the boss itself, Phantom Ganon, and all using paintings, kinda like Super Mario 64. It also introduces the Wall Master, one of the most annoying enemies in Zelda. Overall, the dungeon has some very interesting mechanics, is nicely explorative, and has very solid mini-bosses and boss. It's time to ascend on the ultimate thief in Ganon's castle. It's a bit like the Gerudo's training grounds in that it's more a collection of trials that can be done in mostly any order, save Shadow has to go before Light and Fire. Probably the climax moment for the dungeon itself is when you have to face 2 iron knuckles. You could activate one at a time, but you may as well go all in and take them both on. It lacks a map and compass, probably because it's a collection of trials, but it does have a dungeon item in the form of golden gauntlets to just chuck pillars away. Ganondorf himself seems like a repeat of Phantom Ganon, but after an escape sequence has a more proper pig form fight and you gotta literally beat his tail. As the final area in the game, it really does feel like the ultimate culmination of your skills up to this point and ends on a high note. It's time to overview this time corkscrew. I don't think it's any secret that Ocarina of Time is held in extremely high regard, and while it isn't perfect, it revolutionized the gaming industry and is still a lot of fun even to this day. Any criticisms I have to say about the dungeons most certainly do not reflect the game as a whole, and I still got enjoyment even out of the least and most infamous of them. I can appreciate the semi-linear, structured but with secrets and branching paths, and the better ones like the Forest Temple really personify this feeling of exploration. The 3DS version definitely did a good job improving what needed to be improved as well, even though I'm not a fan of the censorship. Of course, even beyond the dungeons, there's a beautiful plot and a whole heaping amount of world building and questing to be had. I don't think you need me to tell you that it's a very great game, and even if it's not my personal favorite, it's still a must-play if you haven't already.